Carolina Bell's IQ of 187 had earned her everything she ever wanted, but it couldn't save her from becoming a killer at 28. The bloodied chess piece in her trembling hand was proof that intelligence and morality weren't the same thing. The body of Professor Marcus Webb lay sprawled across his office floor, his head twisted at an unnatural angle, eyes staring accusingly at the ceiling. Carolina had come to his office that Tuesday evening to discuss her dissertation defense, not to commit murder. But Marcus had pushed her too far, threatened to destroy everything she'd worked for, and her brilliant mind had calculated a solution in milliseconds that her conscience would spend a lifetime regretting. Carolina's photographic memory replayed the moment with crystal clarity. Marcus had been sitting behind his massive oak desk, that smug smile playing across his lips as he delivered his ultimatum. "Your research is groundbreaking, Carolina, truly revolutionary. But I'm afraid there's a problem with your methodology. Unless you're willing to share credit for your discoveries, I'll have to recommend that the committee reject your dissertation." She'd known this moment would come. Marcus Webb was notorious for stealing his students' work, publishing their ideas under his own name, and destroying careers with a single phone call to the right people. But Carolina had been different from his other victims. She'd been careful, meticulous, brilliant enough to stay one step ahead of him. At least, she'd thought she was. "I have copies of everything," Carolina had said, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "Every email, every conversation, every piece of evidence that shows this work is mine alone." Marcus had laughed then, a sound that made Carolina's skin crawl. "Evidence that you'll fabricate? Carolina, darling, who do you think they'll believe? A respected professor with 30 years of experience, or a desperate graduate student with a history of mental instability?" The mention of her past hospitalization had been the final straw. 2 years ago, Carolina had suffered a complete breakdown when her mother died, spending 3 months in a psychiatric facility recovering from what doctors called acute stress-induced psychosis. It was a dark period she'd fought to overcome, a weakness she'd never wanted anyone to know about. But Marcus had somehow discovered her secret and was now using it as a weapon against her. Carolina's brilliant mind had processed the situation in seconds. Marcus held all the power. He could destroy her career, her reputation, her future with a few well-placed lies. The justice system wouldn't help her. It was his word against hers, and he had all the credibility. Her intelligence, which had always been her greatest asset, suddenly felt like a curse as she saw every possible outcome of this confrontation. Every scenario ended with her losing everything. That's when her hand had closed around the heavy crystal chess piece on Marcus's desk, a king, ironically enough. The same analytical mind that had solved complex equations and unraveled scientific mysteries had calculated the exact amount of force needed, the precise angle of impact, the optimal moment to strike. It was just another problem to solve, and Carolina Bell had always been exceptional at solving problems. The blow had been swift and decisive. Marcus's look of surprise had frozen on his face as he collapsed, his head striking the corner of his desk with a sickening crack. The whole thing had taken less than 30 seconds, and Carolina's mind had already begun analyzing the aftermath before his body hit the floor. Now, standing over Marcus's corpse with blood on her hands and a murder weapon in her grip, Carolina felt the full weight of what her intelligence had led her to do. She wasn't a violent person by nature. She was a scientist, a researcher, someone who solved problems with logic and reason. But logic had told her that Marcus Webb was a threat that couldn't be reasoned with, and reason had shown her that violence was the only solution that guaranteed her survival. Carolina's hands shook as she set the chess piece back on the desk, trying to position it exactly as it had been before. Her eidetic memory showed her the precise angle, the exact distance from the edge. But even as she tried to recreate the scene, she knew it was hopeless. Blood spatter analysis, forensic evidence, witness testimony. There were too many variables, too many ways for even the most intelligent criminal to make mistakes. The irony wasn't lost on her. Carolina had spent years studying human behavior, understanding the psychology of decision-making, analyzing why people made the choices they did. She'd always believed that intelligence was the key to making better decisions, to living a more rational life. But here she was, one of the smartest people she'd ever known, having made the worst decision of her life. As sirens wailed in the distance, someone must have heard the commotion. Carolina realized that her genius-level IQ had become her greatest enemy. She could see every possible consequence of her actions, every way this could go wrong, every life that would be destroyed because of what she'd done. Her brilliant mind, which had always been her salvation, was now her hell. Carolina's mind raced through possibilities as she heard footsteps in the hallway outside Marcus's office. Her intelligence, which had gotten her into this nightmare, now became her only hope of getting out alive. She had maybe 60 seconds before someone discovered the body. 60 seconds to create a plausible alternative reality that would save her from spending the rest of her life in prison. The footsteps passed by Marcus's door without stopping, but Carolina knew it was only temporary reprieve. Campus security made rounds every hour, and it was already past 9 o'clock. She forced herself to think systematically, analytically, the way she'd been trained to approach every problem. What were the facts? What were the variables? What solutions were mathematically possible? Carolina pulled out her phone and took photographs of the crime scene from multiple angles, her hands steady now despite the circumstances. If she was going to manipulate the evidence, she needed to understand exactly what the police would find. Blood spatter patterns, the position of Marcus's body, the location of potential fingerprints, every detail mattered when you were trying to outsmart an entire investigative system. Her photographic memory cataloged every element of the scene, while her analytical mind began constructing alternative narratives. Marcus could have fallen and hit his head. He could have been attacked by someone else. He could have been the victim of a robbery gone wrong. But each scenario required evidence that didn't exist, alibis she couldn't provide, and explanations that wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. That's when Carolina's genius revealed an option she hadn't considered. Instead of trying to cover up the murder, what if she made it look like something else entirely? What if Marcus Webb's death wasn't a crime at all, but the tragic result of his own actions? Carolina knew from her research into Marcus's personal life that he'd been struggling with depression since his divorce 2 years ago. He'd been drinking more, missing classes, and several students had complained about his erratic behavior. It wouldn't be difficult to believe that Professor Marcus Webb had finally reached his breaking point and taken his own life. But suicide required a method, and blunt force trauma to the head wasn't typically self-inflicted, unless... Carolina's eyes fell on the heavy bookshelf behind Marcus's desk, loaded with decades of academic texts and research journals. The shelf was old, poorly mounted, and had been sagging under the weight of too many books for months. What if it had finally given way? Moving quickly but carefully, Carolina began rearranging the scene. She positioned Marcus's body directly beneath the bookshelf, then began removing books from the upper shelves and scattering them around the floor. The physical evidence would show that Marcus had been standing near the shelf when it collapsed, striking him in the head with enough force to cause fatal injuries. But creating the evidence was only half the battle. Carolina also needed to establish her own alibi, and that meant making a decision that went against every instinct she had. Instead of fleeing the scene, she needed to be the one to discover Marcus's body. Carolina wiped down the chess piece and returned it to its original position, then carefully cleaned any traces of blood from her hands and clothing. She used Marcus's private bathroom to check her appearance in the mirror, ensuring that nothing about her looked suspicious or out of place. Her reflection stared back at her with calm, intelligent eyes that betrayed nothing of the chaos in her mind. She waited exactly 17 minutes, long enough for the fictional bookshelf collapse to have occurred naturally, but not so long that someone else might discover the scene first. Then Carolina left Marcus's office, walked to the building's main entrance, and returned as if she were arriving for their scheduled meeting. The hardest part was generating the appropriate emotional response when she discovered Marcus's body. Carolina had studied human psychology extensively, and she knew exactly how someone should react to finding their advisor dead in his office. Shock, horror, disbelief, panic, all emotions she would need to simulate convincingly while emergency responders and investigators examined the scene. When Carolina pushed open Marcus's office door and saw the staged scene, she forced herself to scream. The sound that emerged was raw and genuine, because even though she'd created this tableau herself, the reality of what she'd done hit her like a physical blow. Marcus Webb was dead, and she had killed him, and no amount of intelligence or careful planning could change that fundamental truth. Campus security arrived within minutes, followed by paramedics and police officers who treated the scene as a tragic accident rather than a crime scene. Carolina played her role perfectly, answering questions with just the right mixture of grief and confusion, providing details that supported the bookshelf collapse theory without seeming rehearsed or suspicious. But as she watched the investigators document what they believed to be an accidental death, Carolina felt a new kind of terror settling into her bones. She'd successfully covered up a murder, but that success came with its own horrifying implications. If she could manipulate an entire crime scene this easily, if she could lie this convincingly to trained professionals, what else was she capable of? Her intelligence had saved her from prison, but it had also revealed something about herself that she'd never wanted to know. Detective Ray Morrison, the lead investigator on the case, approached Carolina as the medical examiner prepared to remove Marcus's body. "I know this is difficult, Miss Bell, but I need to ask you a few more questions about Professor Webb's state of mind recently." Carolina looked up at Detective Morrison with tear-filled eyes that held no trace of the calculating intelligence that had orchestrated this entire deception. "He seemed so sad lately," she whispered. "I should have seen this coming." 3 weeks after Marcus Webb's accidental death, Carolina Bell sat in her apartment staring at news articles about other mysterious deaths that had occurred near universities across the country. Her brilliant mind had begun connecting patterns that no one else had noticed, and what she discovered made her stomach turn with a mixture of horror and fascination. The articles were scattered across her coffee table like pieces of a deadly puzzle. Professor Janet Martinez at Stanford, killed when a chandelier fell in her office. Dr. Richard Chun at Columbia, electrocuted by faulty wiring in his laboratory. Professor Susan Walsh at Yale, struck by a falling tree branch during a campus walk. All accidents. All involving academics who had been accused of plagiarism or research theft. All occurring within the past 2 years. Carolina's photographic memory pulled up details from graduate school conferences, academic forums, and research symposiums. She remembered faces now, brilliant young researchers who had presented groundbreaking work only to see their advisors publish identical findings months later. She remembered conversations about stolen ideas, destroyed careers, and the impossible task of proving academic theft when the perpetrators held all the institutional power. What terrified Carolina most wasn't the possibility that other murders were being disguised as accidents. It was the realization that she might not be as unique as she'd thought. Her IQ of 187 had made her feel isolated her entire life, convinced that she was fundamentally different from other people. But what if there were others like her? What if brilliant minds were being pushed to the same breaking point, making the same calculated decisions, solving the same deadly problems? The knock on her apartment door came at exactly 2:17 p.m., and Carolina knew before she opened it that Detective Morrison would be standing on the other side. His expression was different this time, not the sympathetic face he'd worn at the crime scene, but the sharp, analytical look of someone who had started asking the right questions. "Miss Bell, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I have a few follow-up questions about Professor Webb's death." Detective Morrison stepped into her apartment without waiting for an invitation, his eyes immediately scanning the research articles spread across her furniture. Interesting reading material. Carolina's mind processed multiple responses in milliseconds, calculating which approach would be most effective. Play ignorant, act defensively, redirect his suspicions. Her intelligence provided dozens of possible strategies, but she could see in Morrison's expression that he was already several steps ahead of wherever she might try to lead him. "I've been researching academic fraud since Professor Webb's death," Carolina said, choosing honesty as her best tactical option. "His behavior before he died made me wonder how widespread the problem really is. I had no idea how many professors have been stealing their students' work." Morrison picked up the article about Professor Martinez and studied it carefully. 7 suspicious academic deaths in 2 years, all ruled accidental, all involving allegations of research theft. That's quite a coincidence, don't you think? "You suspect they weren't accidents?" Carolina asked, and she was genuinely curious about how much Detective Morrison had figured out. His investigation skills were more sophisticated than she'd initially calculated, and that miscalculation could prove fatal to her carefully constructed cover story. "I suspect that very intelligent people have been solving a very specific problem," Morrison said quietly. "The question is whether Professor Webb's death fits the same pattern, or if it really was just a tragic accident." Carolina felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the true scope of what Detective Morrison was investigating. He wasn't just looking into Marcus Webb's death. He was hunting a serial killer. Or rather, multiple serial killers who all happened to be brilliant graduate students pushed too far by corrupt advisors. "The thing about really smart people," Morrison continued, settling into Carolina's armchair as if he intended to stay for a while, "is that they tend to overthink things. They create elaborate plans when simple solutions would work better. They leave behind patterns because they can't resist showing off their intelligence, even when they're trying to hide their crimes." Carolina's mind raced through everything she'd done in the weeks since Marcus's death. Had she been too clever? Had her intelligence betrayed her by creating connections that a simpler person would never have made? She thought about the research articles on her table, the academic conferences she'd attended, the conversations she'd had with other graduate students about corrupt advisors. "I think I know what you're suggesting," Carolina said carefully, "but I'm not sure I understand why you're here." Professor Webb's death was investigated thoroughly. The bookshelf collapsed due to poor mounting and excessive weight. There was no evidence of foul play. Morrison smiled, and Carolina realized with growing alarm that she was looking at someone whose intelligence might rival her own. "That's true, Miss Bell. There was no evidence of foul play. But there was also no evidence that Professor Webb had been standing near that bookshelf when it collapsed. In fact, the blood spatter patterns suggest he was struck while sitting at his desk, then moved to a position beneath the fallen books." The room fell silent except for the sound of Carolina's heartbeat thundering in her ears. Detective Morrison had seen through her deception, had probably seen through it from the beginning. Her genius-level IQ, which had seemed like such an advantage when she was planning Marcus's murder, had led her to create an overly complex cover-up that revealed more than it concealed. "The other deaths show similar patterns," Morrison continued. "Brilliant students who got too clever for their own good. They thought they could outsmart entire investigative systems, but intelligence without wisdom is just another kind of stupidity." Carolina looked at Detective Morrison with new respect and growing fear. He wasn't just a cop investigating a case. He was hunting some of the smartest criminals in the country, and he was winning. Her mind began calculating new possibilities, new solutions to the problem he represented. But even as those thoughts formed, she recognized them for what they were, the same kind of thinking that had led her to kill Marcus Webb in the first place. "What happens now?" Carolina asked, though she was already computing the answer herself. Morrison leaned forward, his expression almost sympathetic. "Now we find out whether you're smart enough to learn from your mistakes or too intelligent for your own good." Carolina's surrender came not through guilt or fear, but through the mathematical certainty that Detective Morrison held all the winning cards. As she sat across from him in the police station interview room 6 hours later, her brilliant mind had calculated every possible escape route and found them all blocked by evidence she'd been too arrogant to consider. "The fascinating thing about your case, Miss Bell," Detective Morrison said, spreading crime scene photographs across the metal table, "is how your intelligence became your weakness. A less clever person would have simply fled the scene and claimed they'd never been there. But you couldn't resist creating an elaborate cover story." Carolina studied the photographs with the same analytical detachment she'd once applied to her scientific research. The blood spatter analysis was damning, showing clearly that Marcus had been struck while seated at his desk, not standing beneath the bookshelf. Her carefully orchestrated accident scene had been torn apart by forensic science more sophisticated than her planning had accounted for. "You want to know the irony?" Carolina said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I could have gotten away with it if I'd been stupider. If I'd just hit him and run. If I'd never tried to stage the scene. If I'd never started researching those other cases. My own intelligence destroyed me." Detective Morrison nodded, and Carolina saw something unexpected in his expression, respect tinged with sadness. "I've been investigating these cases for 8 months now. 7 brilliant students, all pushed to their breaking point by corrupt advisors, all believing their intelligence made them untouchable. You're not the first genius I've arrested for murder, Miss Bell, and you probably won't be the last." The confession came easily once Carolina accepted the mathematical inevitability of her situation. She walked Detective Morrison through every detail of Marcus Webb's murder, explaining her methodology, her staging process, and the psychological calculations that had led her to believe she could outsmart an entire investigative system. It was like presenting a research paper, clinical and thorough, with her own downfall as the primary data set. "The other cases you've been investigating," Carolina said as Detective Morrison concluded his recording of her statement, "were they all like mine? Brilliant students who got too clever for their own good?" "Every single one," Morrison confirmed. Sarah Kim at Stanford had an IQ of 194. She created an elaborate electrocution scenario that required a PhD in electrical engineering to unravel. Marcus Chen at Columbia was a mathematical prodigy who calculated the exact trajectory needed to make a chandelier fall look accidental. They all thought their intelligence made them special, made them capable of perfect crimes. Carolina felt a strange comfort in knowing she wasn't alone in her particular brand of failure. The isolation that had defined her entire life, the burden of being smarter than everyone around her, had finally connected her to something, even if that connection was through murder and mutual destruction. "What I don't understand," Carolina said, "is how you figured out the pattern. These cases are scattered across the country, handled by different police departments, involving completely different methods. How did you even know to look for connections?" Detective Morrison smiled grimly. "Because I have the same problem you do, Miss Bell. My IQ is 191, and I've spent my entire career watching brilliant people destroy themselves because they thought intelligence was the same thing as wisdom. It takes one to know one, as they say." The revelation hit Carolina like a physical blow. Detective Morrison wasn't just a cop who had gotten lucky. He was someone like her. Someone whose exceptional intelligence had shaped his entire worldview and career path. But where her brilliance had led her to murder, his had guided him toward justice. "The difference between us," Morrison continued, "is that I learned early on that being smart doesn't make you right. Intelligence is a tool, not a moral compass. You can use it to solve problems or create them, to help people or destroy them. The choice isn't determined by your IQ, it's determined by your character." As Carolina was processed through the criminal justice system over the following weeks, she found herself thinking constantly about Detective Morrison's words. Her guilty plea to second-degree murder would likely result in a sentence of 15 to 25 years in prison, time that would allow her to contemplate the relationship between intelligence and morality that she'd never properly understood. The media coverage of her case focused heavily on the genius killer angle, painting her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked intellectual arrogance. But Carolina knew the real story was more complex and more troubling. She wasn't a monster who had been corrupted by her intelligence. She was a product of a system that valued brilliance over wisdom, achievement over ethics, and individual success over collective responsibility. In her final letter to Detective Morrison before sentencing, Carolina wrote, "You were right about intelligence being a tool rather than a virtue. I spent my entire life believing that being smart made me better than other people, when it really just made me more dangerous. Maybe prison will teach me the difference between being clever and being wise." The case of Carolina Bell would eventually become a landmark study in criminal psychology, examined in universities across the country as an example of how exceptional intelligence could become a pathway to exceptional crime. But for Carolina herself, sitting in a prison cell with nothing but time to think, the real lesson was simpler and more personal. She had been so focused on being the smartest person in the room that she'd forgotten to be a good person at all. Her intelligence had given her the power to solve complex problems, but it had never taught her which problems were worth solving or what methods were acceptable in that pursuit. In the end, Carolina Bell's genius had made her capable of committing the perfect murder, but it had also made her arrogant enough to believe she deserved to get away with it. Ready for more psychological deep dives into the criminal mind? Subscribe now for stories that explore the dark side of human intelligence and the thin line between genius and madness. Share this story with someone who loves complex psychological thrillers, and tell us in the comments, do you think intelligence makes someone more likely to commit crimes or less likely to get caught? Your thoughts and engagement help us continue exploring these fascinating intersections of psychology, crime, and human nature. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest explorations into the minds of both criminals and those who hunt them.